In this week's episode, I am very excited to be talking to Elliot Beaty, who is VP of Technology at a company called Fruition, who are based in the US and help people with financial planning and mentorship. Elliot and I are both members of the CTO Craft community, and on their Slack, Elliot has been posting about his big audacious goals of having his developers write no code by the end of 2026. Since then, he has brought that target forward to Q1 2026 and has also experienced a rather impressive result with Claude Code that we'll get into in the episode. Unfortunately, we did have some problems with the quality of the recording in this episode, and you may notice some variability in the volume of our voices. We are working hard to try and make sure that doesn't happen again in future, but hopefully you can see beyond that and enjoy all the exciting things that Elliot has to say. Elliot, you've been posting on the CTO Craft Slack, which we're both members of, about your journey using Gen AI in the development process. And you set some quite ambitious goals to maybe be doing very little development of code, like programmers tapping on keyboards by the end of 2026. Can you tell us about how that's been going, how it started, and the progress that you've seen?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The AI scene in general is something that I'm, to be honest, fairly new to, right? We've had AI coding assistants for quite a while now. I have been fairly reluctant to embrace it until the end of last year, really end of 2024. I got to start with it and I started experimenting with it and seeing what the capabilities were. And I very quickly realized that we were at an inflection point in the industry where affordability was intersecting with viability, right? So for a while, we use Visual Studio for much of our development, and the AI was really just like auto-completing your if statements, and it is past that point where it's just boiler code or it only does scaffolding, and it is well into able to think and operate on tasks at a very high level, the hierarchical tasks. Once I realized that, I realized that we are now in an arms race, right? So if I don't get my team to at this point of being able to use AI for everything, someone else will, my competitors will. And that's when we pivoted hard as a team and really started leaning in on the AI coding tools. We started with Cursor and Windsurf, like many people do. We did some trials between the two. Once I kind of had a feel for the trajectory we're on over the course of 2 months, I would say I could see week over week improvement in these toolings. And basically I set the goal, like you said, to not have my engineering team be writing their own code by the end of 2026. I think we have to get there.
How did that go down? That's like quite an audacious goal as goals go. How did the team feel about that? How did the developers respond to that?
So the business stakeholders, the owner of our company, our president, they're all like, yeah, that sounds amazing because it's, sounds free. The team we had, my engineering team, we had varying degrees of, excitement and terror. Those, the early adopters, the ones that are really aggressive with their, trying new things out, they were all for it. We had some people that were largely ambivalent to it because they were like I was back in early 2024, and then we had some people that were a little nervous that it might replace them. But I also with that I told my team I had no intentions of replacing anyone. Right, this is a productivity tool, not a replacement, and we're fortunate to be in a growth stage, right? So we're going to use AI to offset hiring needs as long as we can. And it's just going to slow that process down. And we're not going the other direction where we're laying engineers off. We're already very lean. And we like everyone on my team is fantastic. We don't have, any fat to cut. They're all high level senior engineers for the most part.
Is it one big team? How many people are on the team? Or are you split across different kind of value streams, or is it all one team working on the same product?
We're separated by skill sets right now. It's the first time I've done it this way, but we have a front end team, we have a back end team, we have a mobile team that does Flutter development. So they handle both Android and iOS. And then we have a QA team of, QA engineers as well. We have about 10 engineers, a couple managers, and then a team of 4 on the QA side. One of them's a test automation engineer. And it works well. I would say, especially for we unintentionally set ourselves up to be structured well for AI development, right? Where we can have one team focusing on making sure front end code quality is really good. The back end team is like specialized in .NET code and .NET Core, and so they have that deep expertise that you need because now you're replacing the more mundane, easy stuff that like a junior or mid level engineer can do, and so you need that expertise.
That's really interesting, like thinking about what it means for team structure and things like that, instead of going cross-functional, kind of having more tech-aligned teams. So you've got that expertise, and it will be interesting to see that kind of pendulum swing from one side to the other in the industry as AI tooling takes more place.
Yeah, and we're really benefiting from it a lot. Is we all have always thought about our teams as like delivering a service for the other team, right? So my backend team that are building APIs, we have a microservices architecture, and they're responsible for providing good documentation through like Swagger. And so what I'm realizing is the most important thing for all of this AI implementation is really good documentation that the AI tooling can hook up to. So by already providing like the Swagger and having a really good Swagger definition file for each API, now our AI agents are far more capable of hooking up to it, figuring out what to use when, and don't need as much babysitting for that. And so we've actually taken a step back and had our engineers take AI agents to another level in documenting all the API endpoints, right? So now we have agents going through all of our like classes and figuring out what properties should be used for what in a response or a payload to an HTTP payload. So we're adding more documentation and really making that very robust because it just helps the AI agents even more. And what used to be a traditionally like bitty job that most engineers really dread is not dreadful anymore, right? Because you just set Claude or Windsurf on it, tell them what to do, and then review it afterwards.
Did you find that I'm going to go nerdy, and like the engineer in me is wondering, did you find that explicit documentation that would typically be read by a human, like the Swagger docs, was the AI able to interpret that better than like self-documenting code? If functions and things were very expressively named, was it as able to interpret those, or did it need the explicit kind of human readable documentation?
It does interpret those, partly because we have it working on code that doesn't have any of that documentation. It does a pretty admirable job when it has access to the code base, right? But also it is doing some of this documentation for us, right? So it is gaining context based on your method names or your variable names. It's looking at the names of like DTO classes and our ORM. It's interrogating that and building its own context for these either properties or methods in the Swagger documentation based on that. And it's doing an admirable job.
I suppose you can imagine that when you set the LLM off to read these functions, read these methods, write some documentation about it, then when it needs to reason about that, and well, reason in air quotes, I'm not going to get into that rabbit hole. Once it's kind of like snapshotting a level of understanding. So instead of having to read the code and understand it all in one go and then make some decisions with it, the documentation is almost like a kind of snapshot or crystallization of what an LLM understood about that function previously.
Yes. Yeah. We're using it, our QA team's using it, and I use it once in a while just to figure out what some code is doing. For example, we use a platform called Agora for live meetings with our mentors right at work. It's kind of like you can schedule a meeting within the app. It's Uber of financial mentors kind of setup. And, we had a bunch of projects set up in the Agora platform, and I didn't know which ones we were using. And so I could just go in there and say like, hey, what endpoints and what app IDs are we using with Agora? That's the only context I gave it. Set it on the right repository, and it went and found that for me. And then it gave me a beautiful printout of, with bullet points of all the things I needed to know, and then some stuff that was extra but useful information. And it was really good at it. It was really impressive. And that was something I would have had to like ask an engineer to step away, context switch, go find out. And then that nobody enjoys going and digging through a repository for that kind of information. And then when you factor in like, we have a secret store for variables, and so you can't always get the actual variable values. It can go do all of that, which is crazy, right? It can actually hook up to the Azure DevOps APIs and go pull values for you if you want. The non-encrypted ones, of course. And it's not only that, but you have complexities with local file, variable files, overriding project level ones, which are overriding global ones, in your environments, and it can navigate all that far more accurately than a human can.
Just thinking of engineering projects I've been on in the distant past when I was still competent enough to write code, of trying to do that diff in your head between the multiple like layers of different properties that apply in different situations. Was it last week you posted an update in Slack that was a bit of a landmark in terms of progress of how far you've got with some of the code generation?
I tell you what, it feels like we're having one of those landmarks every week now. I mean, the ideal state for like every CTO or VP of engineering is to be able to do these little mundane tasks. It's like an afterthought. Last week was the first time where I had a Jira ticket that one of my QA resources created. And it was a bug. It was a valid bug, and actually a pretty complex one, where we had a race condition with payment confirmations coming in and not deduping them properly. And all I did, and I just managed to get Claude Code to work with the Jira hosted MCP server. And I literally just said, fix the issue in ticket number 123. And it went and pulled all the context from the ticket. I had to point it at the right code base. It went and stepped through all the code. It found a race condition between a webhook and a traditional just HTTP controller, API that we talk to with our front end. So it was two completely different parts of the code base that don't have any like logical relationship within the code, right? So it determined all this based on context from the documentation and the variable names and the method names, and identified it, fixed it, got it to build, wrote unit tests. And the only thing it stumbled on that it needed any babysitting was one of the unit tests failed when we got to our, we have a CI/CD pipeline, and where we rerun all the unit tests, and it didn't work in that hosted environment because of how it handled the variable. And I had to copy the error message out of our build pipeline, give it to, in this case, it was Claude, said, hey, when we got, I literally typed, when I ran this in our CI/CD pipeline, this error message was produced, and it went and found the error in the unit test, fixed it. I push it up, right now we have it so it can't actually merge itself, and resolved it all on its own. Not only did we avoid all like the handoff and the planning and, figuring out who can work on it, but it took probably a 2-day task down to like 30 minutes just while I was doing other stuff.
The solving that problem that's like apparently disconnected, that it's not obvious that if there's sort of code reference and there's you're using .NET, aren't you? So it's kind of like, well, I mean, in the back end, so it will be strongly typed. You could compiler could figure that out, but if it's separated, then that's pretty impressive. And one of the other things you mentioned there was the absence of all of the overhead, not just actually doing the programming task, but putting it in the backlog, figuring out who's going to do it, estimating it, all of those sorts of things. It's a non-linear kind of time saving.
Especially for us, we run so lean that, I have 3 back-end engineers that are, pedal to the metal every day. And if I have something like a payment issue come through, that, we consider that like a tier 0 issue, right? If anything that touches revenue, we drop stuff for to work on. And I didn't have to do that. Right. I didn't have to pull one of my very valuable resources off of what they were currently working on to solve this. I was able to just throw AI at it and fix it, which is super valuable to me because it gives me a lot more options when we have a fire drill.
Are you using AI systemically in your development process, or is it on a case-by-case basis? Somebody opens up Claude Code and goes, right, this problem I'm going to try solving with AI, or are there things sat there waiting for tickets to appear and then automatically reacting to them?
They are not waiting for tickets to appear yet. Use case I just described isn't always the case. Sometimes it just fails still, right? And it doesn't solve it. I had it work on a feature similarly. I was like, I don't have anyone to throw on this, but we really need this because when other teams working on it, it was basically email verification for updating your email. It was all broken from a holdover system we inherited, and it did it. It built a pretty good product, but it didn't really fit within our current architecture and the way we were doing email verification on sign up. It missed some reusability stuff. And when I had one of my senior engineers look at it, we kind of realized like, this is good. We can work with it, but we do need to tell it and give it some fundamental changes. And so we can't trust it enough yet for it to just like a ticket comes in, it operates on it and starts working on it. And our inflow of tickets is nonstop. And so I don't have the resources for the code reviews at the tail end. I don't have the QA resources to keep up if Claude was constantly just banging out tickets for us. So right now where we're at is I'm trying to encourage adoption across the whole team. And I have one or two guys that are really focusing heavy on setting up tooling for everyone else, setting up the documentation for everyone else. My goal is that by the end of this year, we'll start sharing that across all the teams. We're going to hit that. We're very close to it already, but there's so much noise out there right now in the dev space for AI tooling that I'm trying to figure out what the best tools are before I just have everyone do it. So like everyone on my team, all the engineers that are writing code have access to Windsurf right now. They have Cursor in some cases, and there's no pressure to use it yet. There's going to be pressure to start using it by the end of this year, and I'm probably socializing this idea because a lot of this is also just creating space for them to feel comfortable about it, right? And learn it. So that's on me. What we're going to do in August is my team doesn't know this yet. So here they're going to find out. Every Thursday is going to be AI Thursday for the month of August, where they don't work on code or projects and they work on learning something about AI. They can try and solve a problem or like a feature or whatever with AI, but the intent is to create space for them to actually like start figuring out what works on their teams, what works for them, how to hook up to our documentation, because we have like tons of markdown files that are being created to provide context in the right places for Claude. And then Friday mornings, we're going to get back together and talk through it, right? And say like, hey, what did you learn? What did you do? And start doing some knowledge sharing. We're just going to do it for a month. No, right now I have one engineer who's basically running a bot swarm. He has tons of Claude agents that are just running. We have them in containers and we can scale them out. The biggest problem right now is getting them to talk to each other successfully. And then he's also like my utility player when we have like a performance issue. So he's performance tuning an API while Claude's building a whole new feature for him. And I'm just trying to keep him as kind of a floater where he's still contributing a lot, but he's working on a pie in the sky feature that we've wanted for a long time that we just can't fit on our roadmap. Right. So it's a brand new ground up internal portal for support that he's building. And it's pretty wild, to be honest with you, what he's done so far. He's done a couple months worth of work in the last week, building a fully admin portal with authentication, authorization, talking to our APIs, modifying client records. It's pretty crazy, but he's leading the charge, knowing that we're going to hook up to whatever his output is eventually across the whole team.
I'm going to have to remember to come back to that later because the whole kind of swarm of Claude Code instances, I'm really interested in finding out more about how that works specifically. You mentioned some of your team are using Windsurf, some are using Cursor. We've mentioned Claude Code as well. It seems like a really great way of experimenting with something that's new. There's so much noise, as you mentioned. There's such a fast rate of change. We don't want to necessarily insist that everybody start using this tool across the board. That would be premature. So it sounds like a quite sensible way that you're adapting to this change. Earlier on, you mentioned that over the year, the results were improving. Was that because the tools are improving with no input from you, or is it about you knowing how to use them better and prompt them better, or is it a combination of the two?
It's a combination of that and us investing the time to build resources for the tooling. So part of it is just do the same task with the same tool a week apart and you're already getting better results. I remember one day I was this was with Windsurf. I was trying to have it build basically an API, right? Or talk to an API. That's what it was. It was talking to, I think it was OpenAI actually. We were, integrating with their APIs and it was failing with some network request error and it failed and it couldn't do it. The next week I came back and looked at it and Windsurf actually stepped out of the project, went to my operating system, started using wget to hand roll its own HTTP requests curl to hand roll its own HTTP requests to troubleshoot the payloads and the responses manually, and then step back into like the code base essentially and implemented, updated its models to get that right. That was just 1 week apart. We saw Windsurf do that. Now that's when I was like, oh my God, this like we're on the hockey stick curve right now, right? This is going so partly that, partly learning curve. So as an engineer, there's a very steep learning curve, and we have found that you need to give it very good step-by-step directions and have it revisit those regularly throughout your coding, and then also having resources that it can lean on. So every one of our microservices, we have an MD file for, markdown file. And with Claude Code specifically, whatever directory it's working in, it will first look for a claude.md file for context. And so in our project structures, we have like the solution, then multiple projects within it, and then maybe a repository folder and a service folder. And each one of those now is getting Claude and markdown file that gives context to what's in that folder, right? And so now when it steps into like we have a CQRS system that we predominantly use. And when it steps into the command handler folder, it has a folder that tells it like, hey, we here at Fruition, we use command handlers for executing requests, and we do our entity framework interactions with it directly within the command handler. We don't use services, even though you may see some services. That's holdover legacy code we no longer use, and it has that context. And so there's less of this like back and forth, like, don't build it that way, do all this over, but with a different architecture. That's a lot of what we were doing early on, and now we don't do nearly as much of that.
It's fascinating to kind of realize that the Gen AI advancements mean that basically we're just going to write better documentation. Like if you were a new engineer coming into one of your projects, that's all stuff that maybe the other engineers might have told you or you might have picked up by osmosis. But now it's like explicitly written down, this is our architectural style. If you see this, don't pay any attention to it. It's kind of great that all of that implicit knowledge in the head is becoming knowledge in the world that is expressed. And that's not one of the outcomes I would have guessed.
I'll be honest, I've traditionally been fairly reluctant to invest in documentation because like every software I've ever worked on is evolving and a living document, right? And unless you're at a really large company where you can afford to have resources dedicated to it, it's from a business value, it's like an 80-20 rule where 20% of the effort gets you 80% of the value with documentation, right? And so I haven't been one to like force engineers to write good documentation. And now all of a sudden it's crucial, right? It's absolutely important, but we also have the tooling to make it really easy and does a far better job. Even a documentation specialist can do sometimes because it has both the technical acumen and the written skills.
The swarm of bots. So I've used Claude Code. I've played with it on the command line. How does that work? Having multiple instances of it, each running in containers, and how do those collaborate?
We're still figuring that out for sure. And a lot of stuff hasn't worked. So we do have containers that spin up, have it all work. My goal for that project was to eventually be able to have hosted service out there that we could scale up as we needed more out in AWS. And, a side benefit of that was going to be not having to buy expensive hardware for my engineers, right? All of a sudden you could just have, a MacBook and connect through SSH and run cloud. That was like my pie in the sky idea. It hasn't worked out that way. We're running into two problems. One is the communication between the agents. So we don't want to invest too much time in building some sort of architecture where you have like a coordinator and an architect and a QA analyst, because I know for a fact that somebody's going to build that for us eventually, right? And Claude has come out with that recently in a beta, and it doesn't work. So we haven't been able to implement it yet, but we're just reluctant to spend too much time on something we know Claude is going to deliver or someone else will deliver. So part of it is the communication between them. And when we did run our own tests, we found that one bot took over, right? So we had like one test we ran, it had like 5 agents trying to talk to each other with different roles. And eventually the architect was just like, this isn't working, I'm going to do it all. And the architect agent just built everything. We're just not there yet. And the other piece is we need a good way to share documentation. And that's the nut we're trying to crack right now, so that they're all working on the same context at the same time, or at least in harmonious ways. And so my original thought for that was actually basically like a RAG model where we had like a shared Postgres instance that they could go to and get context from. And what we're actually finding is that markdown files are a easier way to, one, for us as humans to see what the context is, and two, it's like all the agents work with it pretty natively as it is. It seems to be becoming the standard, which is kind of wild, right? Because the industry went from like XML to JSON, and now we're going to Markdown for a lot of this kind of information you feed bots. And so what we just started doing, one of my engineers built a docu-source, basically like internal website, which is all Markdown driven. And we're going to host that. And then that has very nice folder structures that are easy for an agent to navigate for different architecture, best practices. Eventually we'll have a central one for all the different microservices we have, so that you can get links to the Swagger documentations and it's all easily discovered by an agent. So that's the bit that we're still figuring out, but we have a pretty good traction with, is that sharing of knowledge between the agents.
Waves of Innovation by Resync is more than a podcast. It's a growing community where people across tech come together to navigate the AI native wave. If you're enjoying this, then please sign up to our free weekly newsletter, drop into our live events, and keep an eye out for the pattern library and book we're releasing soon. Everything we make is free because no one should surf this wave alone. Thanks for being part of the conversation. Now, back to the episode. You gave the example earlier of a bug being, almost entirely fixed by Claude Code. I think it was all by itself. The types of problem that you think this is going to be good for solving, have you seen any evidence yet that it will be useful for defining system boundaries? The kind of impression I'm getting talking to people and looking at things is that given an API or an interface or some existing code, kind of filling in the gaps is where the state of the art is right now. It's quite happy doing that. But maybe defining an API, defining, the responsibilities of a microservice, that kind of stuff is still very much like you need to have an architectural knowledge of the whole system and the overall goals. Is that fair?
Yes, I would say that's fair and accurate. Right now, AI is largely monkey see, monkey do, right? It looks at what you've done in your code base and does a pretty good job of imitating it, right? That's at the end of the day, that's what AI is. It's pattern matching. It's not at the point where it can solve a complex architectural problem. It's not even close, I would say. However, for stuff where there's just kind of like an industry best practice already, it is solving it, right? So if we go back to that example where we had the email verification, it decided what endpoints and APIs to build, and it defined the architecture itself. And it left a code comment saying like, hey, you need to plumb this bit into your event bus, because we didn't have context for, how our microservices talk to each other, which is event driven. It knew enough to leave some comments saying like, we need to send, a notification on the event bus to trigger this email. It did a pretty admirable job, and it was certainly as good as like a mid-level engineer could have done. But now if you want to start talking about like asynchronous document loading that's driven off of a queue and some of those more advanced subjects that aren't your traditional CRUD application problems to solve, or it'll do it and you're just going to roll the dice. Maybe it'll be good, maybe it'll be a terrible implementation.
That's actually touches an interesting issue or question, or I think it's an interesting question because I'm going to ask it. The bug that got solved was it was indirect. There wasn't a direct code link. With architectural styles, you mentioned kind of event-driven systems there and, being connected up via an event bus. Is it harder in your experience for Gen AI to figure out what's going on in quite decoupled systems, or is it smart enough to figure that out? Is it better to have things more tightly coupled so that the AI can figure out what's going on?
You don't need to. Is it better? Yeah, especially if you're in a strongly typed language where classes are easily discoverable and interface implementations are easily found. But we're not like that. We're very microservices driven. We have a lot of libraries that are not part of the same code base, and it can do it pretty well. But what you have to look out for is it's going to think it can do it no matter what. So if you don't provide it like the repository with the other chunk of code that's not part of its context currently, it's going to assume make some other erroneous assumption that this is how it works, right? There's still this very optimistic, I can do anything if you asked me to, AI agent mentality, quote unquote. That's where you run into problems. And we see that quite a bit, right? Like we give it a task, but we don't give it all the information it needs to solve the task, and it still finds a way to solve it, or at least it thinks it solved it. And that may mean it goes and creates like 10 APIs if you're not careful, right? Like it goes and builds a whole system because it doesn't think it exists. And in fact, that's been one of our biggest challenges, is it building more than we ask for, right? So I told you I have this one engineer that's working on rebuilding our internal admin, call it our admin portal. We as Fruition employees can modify customer data or troubleshoot stuff. And it built things like profiles for the admins. We don't care about that, right? I don't need a profile picture for one of my, 30 employees here at Fruition. All this little ancillary stuff that is traditionally part of maybe that system, or it sees examples of that on the internet or whatever. I don't know where it got the ideas from. It went and implemented. And we didn't want any of that. And now we're actually spending more effort telling it to remove that stuff. Or we give it requirements. One example is we gave it a requirement to be able to, have basically CRUD operations for client organization of ours, right? Because we sell in, one way we sell in is through HR departments, essentially. And it built all sorts of features. It built a wizard, and all we really needed was to be able to enter the organization name, contact information, and we were done. But then it built 3 more steps in the wizard that we didn't ask. So again, we weren't good enough with our requirements, and we just let it run wild, and it built more than we asked for. Good problem to have, right? Some of the stuff we're like, that's actually pretty good. We'll keep that. Some of the stuff you can just get sucked down the rabbit hole if you're not careful.
I love the idea that we might need to fine tune these coding LLMs to be more insecure, more nervous, and less gung ho.
I haven't seen any like raw wild hallucinations. That's what a lot of people talk about. That's one of the buzzwords you hear on LinkedIn, right? I haven't seen any of that, to be honest with you. When it does go kind of wild and outside of what you were expecting it to do, it's because it's trying to solve the problem and the only way it can figure out how. And it's not always bad. Sometimes it's actually pretty good and it works, but a lot of times it's just extra noise.
Where do you see this going? If the current trajectory holds and it continues getting better at the rate that it has done, and your team become more comfortable and continue to achieve success with this, where do you think that if the team are not going to be writing all the code themselves, what's the kind of the next big milestone? How do you see their roles evolving and the way that the team operates evolving?
That's a good question. Part of our challenge is we're trying to do all this while we're growing as a company. And what I'm actually seeing with my engineers is that they have less time than more, right? This isn't creating space for them to work less hours in the day. It's creating more channels that they can work on simultaneously. And so what happens is this development process is quicker, but all the other housekeeping stuff you do to actually write production quality code that you can take live, like code reviews and architectural meetings and QA and back and forth with QA and talking to your product team, that stuff is stacking up, right? We're doing a lot more of that now because the coding bit goes faster. And so there's definitely going to be a need and probably a scarcity of senior level engineers in the short term, I would guess, because we are able to replace right now junior and mid-level engineers. And so the value of a senior engineer is going up because they have no longer is their job also to produce code. It's really to ensure quality. So on my team, we'll be hiring only senior engineers probably moving forward. And their job is going to be largely understanding systems, understanding the nuances of like how our microservices interact with each other, and then supporting the agents, right? So building tooling to help with documentation and the markdown files or solving the problems that the AI can't, right? Making sure that the agents aren't building solutions to problems we don't have. We've seen that quite a few times where like it goes and builds all sorts of features for like logging and troubleshooting and graphing error rates and quite literally hooking into providers that we've never used before, right? Installing the NuGet packages and wiring up because it's a good idea. And it's like, yeah, actually, that was a pretty good idea, but we don't need that. So, controlling the bounds of the project, but it's going to be a lot less coding for sure. And what I've been struggling with personally and also seeing on my teams now manifest a little bit is this multitasking overload, right? Where people are like context switching is the norm because they're working on something themselves and they have two bots, agents going and writing code, and the agent gets stuck on something or he has to ask you a question or needs approval to run a command on your system, and you have to switch back, right? And so for me personally, I struggle with it a lot. My mental fatigue is really strong at the end of the day now compared to when I wasn't doing as much. I think it's because of that context switching. But that's where I see it going. What I don't know is we're going to have this drop off in people entering the engineering workforce, right? Because AI is replacing them. That we're going to have a gap because the senior folks will move on, they'll retire, I don't know what, but they won't be in the workforce anymore. There'll be this gap where we know we need people moving into these senior roles, but we don't have them to do, right? Because the kids coming out of college didn't have to learn these important skills like architecture and strong entity relationship design for your database structures and these fundamentals that my generation spent many classes and courses covering at university. I don't know that that's going to be necessary. And so I don't know how we're going to fill this gap, a decade from now.
I think that's a really good point, and maybe the alarm bell needs ringing for academia and education, because I can entirely see that problem. In architecture for physical buildings, there is certainly in the UK there is no such thing as a junior architect. Legally, you have to have done a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree, which is another couple of years after your first university degree, to be able to call yourself an architect. I wonder if in the future programmers, the kind of act of coding will be more like, I don't know, bricklaying or something like that. And like the entry level to the software industry will be more knowledge about things like CQRS, event sourcing, CRDTs, all this kind of bigger picture stuff that new to me when I entered the industry. It's like, great, I can just about program in Java, I can get a job. and all the other stuff was like arcane knowledge that was passed down to me by principal engineers.
I'm of the same generation where, man, if you had a pulse and a keyboard, you could get a job as an engineer here in the US, right? When we were coming out of college. And it made a lot of space for a lot of mediocre people or people that weren't really interested in tech, but they liked the salaries that came with it. And they could carve out a good living. Those people, those engineers are as good as replaced right now today. And it's going to put an emphasis on the really high value ones, right? That top 1% that are really intelligent or staying up to date with new technologies and new design patterns. And yeah, it's going to be an issue. I can tell you right now, I wouldn't hire anyone that didn't have AI tooling experience, right? If I sat down with an engineer for a new position and they were like, I don't use any AI tooling, that'd probably be the end of the interview. It's going to be so important moving forward. And I think that's what universities are going to have to focus on, is teaching their students how to use these tools, teaching them the stuff that AI can't do natively right now or effectively right now. And it's going to probably be a lot more theoretical stuff, right? Less about nuances of a particular language. I'm all of a sudden a Python developer. I never used to be a Python developer, but right, like AI is really good at it and it builds stuff really quickly. So I'm learning it. I don't think you're going to have to know how to troubleshoot your own code.
Like Python, I was playing around with Cursor a couple of months ago, and it's like I've never really done Python. I just about read it, but not write it. And I was like, I've got to write a for loop. I've written, God knows how many for loops, God knows how many languages. And I was like, just do it for me. And I was like, yeah, I don't need to know all the tedious ins and outs and the idiosyncratic differences between languages anymore. So that was thoroughly pleasant. The changes that you've made, have they started to have any impact on the rest of the business? Do the product folks and the people that are inputting requirements into your teams, are they aware of any of this yet?
Yes, they feel it. Our output as of this month is about 250% greater than it was in October of last year.
Wow.
So we're measuring that by number of tickets going through our QA team passing and story points really. However, that number is skewed a little bit because in that time our tasks and our features have been wildly more complex as well. So it's not apples to apples. We've bitten off some really huge, challenging features that are very, very intricate and nuanced in that time as well. So the productivity gains are greater than that, and we're just getting started. So the product team is definitely struggling to keep up because of this newfound velocity. Who's feeling it the most, I would say, though, is our QA team. The tooling for QA resources is not there. Even our automation engineer isn't getting the gains out of AI tooling that are comparable to what the engineers are seeing. QA inherently, our testers, like they have a skill set that AI doesn't have right now, which is that critical thinking bit, right? There's still a lot that AI can do, and we're trying to figure out how we can help them. But right now, the answer is to hire more on that team because the tooling's not there. We've done deep dives into tooling, and a lot of it on the QA side, at least, is around building test automations. We already have a guy that specializes in that, that's amazing at it, and does a better job than AI can. What we've seen when we've tested some of that tooling is that it's really meant for people who haven't invested in a quality QA team and just need like a product manager to write some test cases and try and get some automation out there, right? It's not the super intricate stuff like we have where it's, it creates a new account, does a bunch of tests after it logs in and then deletes the account and cleans up after itself, right? Like AI is not able to do that kind of critical thinking yet. At least we haven't seen it and the tooling's not there. So we're bottlenecking at our QA team. Our product team is just barely keeping up now. It's getting worse, right? Like as we invest more in the AI tooling, the velocity is going up and it is creating challenges.
Fascinating here, and it's kind of theory of constraints. You speed up one part of the value stream, and then all of a sudden you see where the bottlenecks are in other parts. Is the rest of the organization kind of aware of this, and do they have good ideas of what they can do about it, or is it at the moment sort of not entirely conscious that, like, hey, we might have to make some changes elsewhere in our process?
The QA team is absolutely trying hard they see the problem. They're trying to find a way to solve it. The product team, similar, they're already really quite efficient and are also constrained by some of the tooling available, but things like Figma and Linear are getting their own MCP servers and they're getting some tooling there. So that's getting better, but still lagging behind. And again, much of what they do is the creative half of the brain, right? Which is where AI struggles. And so it's just not as good as code, which is fairly, black and white. The marketing team, we uses it heavily. So we have a growth team that handles marketing and sales, and they're integrating everything they can. There's actually a lot. I think marketers are just inherently very process and automation driven. And so there's already quite a bit of stuff there that's helping them, and a lot of content, which Claude's very good at. So yes, we're growing. I have the luxury of having an engineer that I can just throw at it like every day, right? And it's pretty easy to justify spending that time on it because we are getting huge ROI on that investment. These other areas, it's harder to do because the ROI just isn't as strong.
And thinking about that, the larger organization and what you were mentioning about marketing, was the drive for Gen AI in the development process, was that something that you took upon yourself? Was there a kind of board level edict coming from on high, like we need to be an AI first enterprise? Was it just inside dev? Is it everywhere, or is it kind of happening organically from the bottom up?
Everyone's been doing a little bit of it just on their own, right? Because like just having a subscription to ChatGPT for $20 a month is super valuable, even in your just day to day, right? So everyone's kind of, not everyone, most people are already kind of adopting it organically that way. But it was my decision to drive us towards fully AI. And then I went and dangled the shiny object, right? Like we did it, and they were like, holy shit, look at what we just did. And then we showed that to the other people, and now everyone's a believer. So we have a really strong relationship with Financial, which is a huge $1 billion investment firm, and they're seeing some of this output too. And now everyone's leaning in, right? Like I told you, the financial industry is inherently kind of slow to adapt, and that's not the case right now. I think everyone is seeing that this is the future. We just don't know what it looks like. I realized that this was an inflection point for my team, and it was either sink or swim. We were going to figure this out because it is the future. There's no denying it, or we were going to get beat. So we just did it.
It's surprising to me the number of developers that I know who are still somewhat AI skeptic, or, kind of, it's happening somewhere else. I don't need to get too involved in it. I'm just going to carry on doing what I do because it's not going to replace me. And I'm saying that it necessarily will, especially for mid to senior people, but it's definitely going to have an impact, and you should probably be preparing for that.
I think it may not replace senior engineers right now, but you're going to get squeezed out by an engineer that does embrace AI. And what I have found is you have to have a champion within your dev ranks that can build and dangle the shiny objects, right? And that's where I've really gained a lot of traction getting people to buy in. Is we'll have this engineer go and he built something overnight, right? Like this admin portal would have been months of building. He built it in a week, and it's amazing. And it solves a huge business need because the old one was just terrible. And that's where we started to get believers. And after, he does a demo, and then another engineer who says, hey, can I get a Claude license, please? That was like, they're feeling the pressure because their peers are becoming so productive. So, and like I said, it is up to me to some extent to give them space to learn this on the clock, right? I don't expect anyone to go home and do work or stuff for work outside of their working day. And so I need to provide space. And I haven't done that for everyone yet. I need to.
Yeah, the upcoming, as yet surprise the team AI Thursday sounds like a great way of doing that. I really like the idea of, as a senior developer, you're not going to get replaced by AI. You're going to get replaced by a senior developer who is embracing AI. I think that's a really good way of putting it.
Exactly. And, another thing I've noticed, I've been in leadership now for a number of years, and oftentimes things like paired programming or code camps or hackathons are like, we want to do them because we want to learn new stuff or we want to experiment with technologies, but it's really hard to sell the benefits of that to other stakeholders in the organization, right? Your leadership, or explaining to the product team why you're taking a week off to do a hackathon, because the ROIs hasn't traditionally been there, right? Like you build games or whatever during a hackathon. With AI, we see an immediate return on investment. Just spending a day to get one engineer back up to speed is going to probably double or triple their output that same week, right? Once they get a taste of it and start using it. And so it's very, very, very easy to sell this to the business users. Additionally, like with tooling, like Claude's expensive. It's $200 a month for one engineer, right? Dirt cheap because I'm essentially tripling his output, right? So with a really high value resource, especially for you have US engineers where you're paying them a couple $100,000 a year, the $200 a month is a drop in the bucket. Even with offshore resources that are making anywhere from like $6,000 to $10,000 a month, $200 a month is so justifiable. It's so easy to invest in that tooling. You get an immediate return on it.
given the kind of productivity gains you're saying. I did hear that right, 250% in terms of team velocity improvement there or thereabouts,
Yes.
given the changing complexity.
Just in story points making its way through our QA team. And that was over the course of the last, I guess, 6-7 months.
Awesome. We are getting close to an hour and probably let you get on with your day. And my ears are beginning to hurt from these, studio headphones that I'm wearing, which of course the people listening to the podcast won't be able to see, but trust me, they are big fat over-ear headphones. I think maybe we've already touched on this a little bit, but for either technology leaders or senior developers who are kind of advocating up, what kind of advice would you give to people to help them adopt this new technology in the most straightforward way with the greatest chance of success?
So part of this is also pitching it to your business and making all the other stakeholders feel good about you dabbling with this. And tools like Windsurf, Cursor, they're cheap. They have an IDE, right? So you're actually seeing the files change while the AI agent's doing it. It's a very easy way to step into it. And it's low cost. So if you give everyone a license, or even just a handful of engineers a license to Windsurf, it's pretty affordable. What I have found is even with your own engineers, you need to flow feed this because it's so deep. You can't just jump right into the middle of the ocean. You got to start at the shoreline and start swimming out slowly. And so you want to start small, have one engineer do it, figure it out, then bring another engineer in, and then figure out what tooling works for you. And then you start investing in the more expensive tooling and dangling the shiny objects. And then, I think where I made a mistake early on was over communicating this big audacious goal I had of basically replacing people at keyboards coding, right? And instead, I've had much more success saying like, hey, Alan, go check this tool out, see what you can do with it, see what it does for us. And then that's been far easier to gain support.
Right. Well, Elliot, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. It's really good to hear from someone who is actually doing this stuff and rolling it out in their organization and seeing great results from it, instead of just crowing on LinkedIn about how, AI is going to change the world. You wouldn't catch me doing that, of course not. So yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. And maybe we, 6 months or something, we can catch up, and it would be great to hear about the progress that you've made.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'm taking notes along the way. So I'd love that.
So there you have it. I was quite interested to hear from Elliot about how the rest of the organization is responding now that software developers are going faster, and also how the other things like architectural discussions aren't being automated away. That seems to be in line with what was in the latest Dora report, that the actual act of programming is the bit that's getting automated, and all the bits either side of it are still there. Hopefully you enjoyed that episode. If you have any feedback, then please make sure that you reach out via email to wavesofinnovation@resync.com. That's re-cinq.com. If you liked this episode, then please share it with somebody else that you think might enjoy it too. And otherwise, be good to each other, and I'll catch you in the next one.